Every time you open the Bible, you are walking into an orchard. In Hebrew, the word for orchard is Pardes. But for the ancient sages, Pardes wasn't just a place, it was an acronym. A map for the human soul to navigate the infinite layer of the divine word. When a preacher is delivering a sermon, he tends to apply this acronym, whether they realize it or not, to bring across the message they're trying to deliver to the congregation. There are 4 gates to the orchard. Peshat, which is the surface. This is the plain, literal, historical meaning. It is what the text says on its face. Remez, the hint. This is the level of hints and allusions. It's where one verse whispers to another across the centuries through patterns and wordplay. Midrash, or inquiry. This is the realm of Midrash. It's the homiletical application where we ask why and fill in the gaps of the story to find ethical truth, thought, or secret. This is the mystical or cosmic dimension, the hidden spiritual reality that lies beneath the symbols. To flesh out these concepts, let's apply them to one of the most controversial events in Scripture, the Akedah. The word Akedah literally means the binding, referring to the moment Abraham bound his son Isaac to the altar. In his book, Abraham's Silence, scholar Richard Middleton points out a haunting reality. Genesis 22, for example, tells us nothing explicit about what Abraham feels as he climbs Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son. It is anachronistic to imagine that Abraham may have been bewildered by God's command, wondering how God could demand that a father slay his son, confused about how God had finally fulfilled this promise to Abraham, and now threatened to undo them, terrified that perhaps he would not be able to sacrifice his son, and no less terrified that perhaps he would, guilt-ridden about what Sarah would say, and so on. The biblical text is notoriously thin. It tells us what happens, but it rarely tells us how the characters feel. This is where the preacher finds their greatest opportunity and their greatest danger. Middleton notes that the narrator's silence invites the reader to enter the story. When a preacher uses the inquiry of Midrash, they're asking the questions the text ignores. What did Sarah say when Abraham took her only son? What was the look on Isaac's face when he realized he was the lamb? A preacher can use this to encourage a congregation by highlighting the protests inherent in faith. Middleton argues that Abraham's silence in Genesis 22 is actually a disturbing departure from his character. Think back to Genesis 18, when God tells Abraham he is going to destroy Sodom. Abraham doesn't stay silent. He stands his ground and bargains. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Abraham was a man who knew how to argue with God for the lives of strangers. Why then is he silent when it comes to his own son? By using the inquiry method, a preacher can encourage those who feel crushed by blind obedience. They can suggest that perhaps the text records Abraham's silence not as a model to be mindlessly mimicked, but as a tragic tension. Middleton suggests that the Akedah might be a test that Abraham failed, not a test of obedience, but a test of his willingness to intercede for his son as he did for Sodom. When we move to the level of Remez, or the hint, the text begins to glow with foresight. Consider the moment Isaac looks at his father and asks, "Behold, the fire and the wood, where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham's response is a masterpiece of prophetic hinting. He says, God will provide for himself the lamb. In the Hebrew, this can be read as, God will provide himself as the lamb. Later, after the ram is provided, Abraham names the place Jehovah Jireh, saying, on the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Preachers often use this hint to bridge the gap to the New Testament. They suggest that Abraham, in that moment of trauma and relief, saw the future. He saw the day when God would truly provide himself as the sacrifice on the very same mountain range. It is a hint towards Jesus on the cross. While these tools can bring deep insight, they can also be used for evil, or at least for spiritual harm. The danger lies in using the inquiry or secret levels to bypass human suffering. Middleton warns against the sacrificial piety that glorifies trauma. If a preacher uses Midrash to suggest that Isaac wanted to be killed, or that his trauma didn't matter because it was a type of Christ, They are committing what Middleton calls theological violence. You use these methods for evil when you use them to silence the suffering of your congregation. If you want a submissive, unquestioning church, you might preach Abraham's silence as the only way to please God. You effectively tell your flock, don't be like Job, don't protest, just lay your children on the altar and say nothing. But look at Job. Job is the ultimate protester. When he loses everything, he doesn't stay silent like Abraham did at Moriah. He cries out. He demands a day in court, and he challenges God's justice. And what is God's response? At the end of the book, God says that Job, the one who complained and questioned, had spoken of him what is right, while his friends who offered pious and correct-sounding justifications for suffering were wrong. The preacher's task is to use the Pardes, the orchid, to open the text, not to colonize it. Use the surface meaning to keep your people grounded in history. Use the hints to show them that God's plan is woven through time. Use the inquiry, or Midrash, to give them permission to feel the weight of the story. When you preach the Akedah, don't just give them a Sunday school lesson. Use this insight to show them that faith isn't just about yes, Lord. Sometimes faith is found in the intercession or the lamentation. By showing the contrast between Abraham's bargaining for Sodom and his silence for Isaac, you teach your congregation that God values their voice. You show them that the secret of the Bible isn't a code to be cracked, but a relationship to be lived. A relationship where Job or even Jacob were allowed to wrestle with the Almighty until the dawn breaks. The orchid is beautiful, but the fruit is potent. If you enter, go with humility. Respect the literal story enough to stay grounded, but love the mystery enough to stay expectant.